the other day something happened that may not have had that much of an impact in what might be called liberal enclaves of the country or in Democratic, progressive, or lefty circles. I think it was noted, but I think it probably had a much bigger impact in other parts of our nation and in other segments of society. I'm talking about the death at the age of 99 of the Reverend Billy Graham. Our next guest wrote a piece that was headlined, "Billy Graham, Dead at Age 99, Transformed American Christianity and the Republican Party," and I believe that is true. Sarah Jones is a reporter, staff writer at the New Republic, and she's been on the program before and yet was willing to come back. So first of all, Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Secondly, Billy Graham, if I recall, we were talking a little bit before the segment, and I mentioned that even though I grew up, I actually had a bar mitzvah, but then later in my youth, I was sent or went to live with evangelical Christian relatives, where for them and for everyone in the Central Valley of California that they associated with, for the tent revivals where I was drafted to play electric bass while my uncle played the organ or piano, in that entire segment of the population, we're talking many years ago, Billy Graham was a monumental figure. And I have a feeling that maybe where you grew up, the same thing was true as well, right?
Yeah, I grew up in a really evangelical home, and I went to an evangelical college, and so Graham was kind of always this towering figure in our home and our church life, and I think that's true for a lot of evangelical people my age and older.
Yeah, and you know, I actually got a glimpse at those tent revivals and elsewhere of the sort of the pre-Graham Christianity too, even though that was before even my time. You know, what might be called the old, weird, haunted Christianity of the backwoods and the hollows and the forests and so on, which frankly has more electricity for me. But it seems almost as if Billy Graham took, this isn't the right analogy, but maybe you can help me. It's almost as if he took Christianity and made it corporate. He put a nice suit on it. He drew gigantic crowds. He hobnobbed with presidents of both parties, and he institutionalized evangelical white Christianity, and I know he had a lot of African American followers as well, but he institutionalized that kind of Christianity and took it to a new level, didn't he?
You know, it's hard to tell when you look back at Billy Graham's life, like how much of that institutionalization was delivered and how much of it wasn't. Because if you think of him as an evangelist, you know, if we just take him at his word for a moment, like he needed to reach as many people as possible in order to evangelize, and having a public platform is a really good way to do that. But of course, like we know him as America's pastor because that's what he wanted to be known as, and he sought the spotlight. So I almost don't know if he took it corporate in a way, because he certainly wasn't the first person to hold a tent revival or to attract a mass following in the way that he did, but he was a very good showman, and he was very good at theater, and he was very good at using emerging technologies at the time, like television. Radio was more established, but to really get his message across to the broadest possible audience. And in doing so, he set a model for other people to follow, and they did.
Yeah, and yet somehow, and I haven't gone back and looked at videos of him since his death, so it's been quite a few years. But I remember at the time there were other preachers I liked, and just speaking of preaching as an art form, which is I think it's an amazing American art form, whatever your religious beliefs. And I just feel like where there were other preachers who were like wild rock and roll preachers, and other preachers who were like, jazz preachers, and other preachers who were mountain preachers. He was almost like and this is going to like offend people, but I'm sorry. He was almost like the REO Speedwagon or something of preaching. It was just very palatable in a way that lost its edge and appeal for me. I don't know if that makes any sense to you or not.
He's always struck me like he's very much a Southern preacher, and not necessarily not necessarily like the revivalist that a lot of people who grew up in the South would maybe recognize. Like there was no speaking in tongues, for example. There weren't any healings. He wasn't a charismatic, but he was very Southern, and he spoke very simply and very directly, and that was part of his appeal as an evangelist. And it's just really interesting to me. It's always been very interesting to me that he was able to take what was essentially a very simple set of ideas and make them so compelling to so many people.
Yeah, and that he really did do. And he was almost like American politicians of both parties. He was almost like a touchstone that you had to approach and pay homage to if you wanted, for example, to be president of this country. It's almost in a sense, he wielded enormous influence that went well beyond religion into politics, didn't he?
He did, and I think that's one of the most important things, in fact, about his career. You know, to his credit, he reached out to people from both parties. It's not necessarily something that we can say about the contemporary Christian right. Like, there's a reason we refer to it as the Christian right. But he was a kingmaker, and he did politics. He was actually fairly political and very conservative. And so, you know, I don't think that he would have gone as far as some contemporary leaders of the Christian right. I don't think he would go as far as his own son goes. But he was certainly political, and he did sort of set this model for politicizing Christianity in a very specific way that other people picked up on later and perfected.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense to me. And you also note something in your piece about him in the New Republic, that what you say is what evangelical means now is not what it meant when Graham began his career. I thought this was a great point. It's mutated from religious identity to demographic signifier. It increasingly means white and Republican. I would argue that if Graham was sincere in his desire to evangelize, which was, you know, to bring his message, the Christian message, to as many people as possible, you'd think that that would be something he would want to oppose, that he would want to universalize his message and make it appeal to everyone. And I wonder if he ever expressed any thoughts of dismay or disapproval of this demographic, pigeonholing of what it means to be evangelical, or whether he approved or whether he took no notice. Do you know anything about that?
Well, he really faded from public life deliberately over the last few years. So, you know, Franklin would say that he was speaking for Billy Graham, but, you know, I think we should question how true that actually was. So I don't know actually what he thinks of the contemporary state of evangelicalism. We do know that at times he was very critical of himself and his own actions, where he seemed to express regret at times for how deeply he involved himself in the political process. But, you know, he kind of let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak, already, and there was no putting it back in.
Yeah, and you quoted in your piece, you actually quote NPR, quoting a historian as saying Billy Graham could confer, quote, acceptability on wars, shame on racial prejudice, desirability on decency, dishonor on indecency, and prestige on civic events. And he certainly was amazing at all of those things, but acceptability on wars, that doesn't seem to me like a very good thing. And he also, as you point out, he wasn't a theologian. He was more of a communicator. But you also point to, and I think it's important to note, some of the more shameful aspects of his own private behavior, including the conversation with Nixon, where you quote the stranglehold, his complaining about the Jewish quote-unquote stranglehold on the country. And of course, there was also something in there about basically saying there were good Jews and then Jews who belonged to the synagogue of Satan, if I remember correctly. So, I mean, he definitely was capable of appealing to and reinforcing and expressing some deep prejudice in his private life, right?
I mean, so what you quoted, that's from the Nixon tapes, and what he's saying, it's this really vitriolically anti-Semitic passage where he's repeating this very old anti-Semitic trope about, you know, Jewish people having a stranglehold on society, and he's very explicit, and he says that, you know, they think that I'm their friend, and, you know, really I'm not their friend. Like, it's very detailed, it's very explicit, and he apologized for it later. But it, you know, when something is that detailed and, you know, very deliberately saying, you know, I'm pretending to be their friend, I'm pretending to care about them, you know, I don't think the apology quite cuts it. And of course, he said some very prejudiced things about gay people as well over the years.
Yeah. So how do you remember or think of Billy Graham now? From, you know, you've evolved from, or in some ways, I don't presume to speak for you, but seem to have evolved from your evangelical upbringing in a lot of ways, and certainly politically. So how do you look back on Billy Graham's life?
You know, it's complicated. He was just so much of the fabric of our lives, at home, at church, at school. You know, he was just this towering presence. And, you know, evangelicals don't necessarily have a concept of sainthood, but he was certainly regarded as this very good and holy person, and like one of the few celebrity preachers where you never really heard any rumors about scandals or affairs in his private life. So he was very much put on a pedestal by everyone, and was highly respected, as was Franklin Graham at first, although I think perhaps that's less true now. So yeah, he's almost like this paternalistic figure, I think, for me and for a lot of other people, and that can be good in some respects, and then it's very bad in a number of other respects.
Yeah, you know, I have to tell you on a personal note that my aunt passed away last year, and when I went into, you know, collector things and all that, there were a bunch of Billy Graham books and posters and so on. Not posters, but, you know, decorative things. I did not keep them. But that's, you know. And as for Franklin, believe me, I think we could probably do a whole segment on Franklin. As you describe him, he is a vituperative, Muslim-hating, gay-bashing reminder that the admixture of Christianity and Republican politics benefited the latter more than the former, and that's certainly true. So any closing thoughts about Billy Graham before we say goodbye?
Yeah, you know, I've read some people write that, you know, we're not going to get another Billy Graham, and I think that that's true, actually, and I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. You know, when you consider the entire context of his life. But he was a fascinating, at times paradoxical figure, and the events of his life really tell us a lot, not just about the origins of the Christian right, but they help us understand sort of the history of American Christianity itself. So he's a fascinating person to read about, and like even the more prejudicial aspects of his life, I think, are very instructive and really telling.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And look, he had a big influence on American history and American religion and politics. He was, whatever you think of the content, he was one of the great communicators of his era, charismatic, as you say, and eloquent. And now he is gone. So Sarah Jones of the New Republic, thanks for writing about him, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.